If Victor can corroborate his hunch that they descended from the ancient mummy people, a startling conclusion would be inescapable. This region on the very doorstep of ancient China was continuously populated by people of European origin from as early as 1800 BC.
There's some pretty impressive features in this cave. We see the red beard and red hair parted in the middle. It's a distinctive style of the Tocharians. He's wearing a coat with wide lapels on both sides and it folded over. It's a shame that these figures have all been defaced by people of other faiths at some time in the past. But it's very easy to see what they looked like, and we can tell who they were.
The Tocharian figures are strikingly similar to the mummies that lived in these parts 1,000 years earlier.
This donor has blonde hair and a long nose and an Indian caste mark, which we call a tika.
Ancient DNA revolution is rewriting the history of man. Historical theories, which describe how languages, ideas, and civilization came to be spread across the world, can now be checked against an increasing pool of ancient genetic data. One of the most remarkable events being revealed in increasing detail by the recent ancient DNA studies is that of the Indo European expansion. Prior to these recent studies, it was widely thought by many archaeologists that the expansion of Indo European languages and ideas were the result of a kind of cultural diffusion, a meeting of minds between ancient populations, as it were. However, we now know that Indo European languages were spread through the wide-scale conquest carried out by an ancient population who were nearly genetically identical to modern Northern European populations living today. These ancient European people came to dominate huge parts of Europe, the Middle East and Asia. They also played an important role in the establishment of many of the world's first civilizations. Ancient DNA studies now show that 3,500 years ago, Indo-Europeans, originating out of the coded word culture in Northern Europe, were approaching the plains of central China. These ancient Europeans were the most technologically advanced people of the age. They were armed with the most advanced bronze weaponry, the world's first composite bows, domesticated horses, and the world's first superweapon, the warrior chariot with spoked wheels. The Chinese population they were to encounter were just emerging out of the Stone Age, with limited metalworks, primitive weapons, and few signs they engaged in large-scale organisation. An ancient DNA paper out of Harvard called The Genomic Formation of Human Populations in East Asia was published in March this year. It provides an insight into what happened when ancient European and Chinese populations came to collide. The paper provides evidence to support a theory which was widely held by archaeologists prior to the 1940s, a theory which suggested that Indo-European, or then termed Aryan people, were responsible for the spread of technology and ideas necessary for early civilization to take root in ancient China. Over 5,000 years ago, the first Indo-European speaking populations of the Yamnaya culture in the steppes of Eastern Europe were the first people to domesticate the horse. 1,000 years after initial expansion out of the steppes into northern and central Europe, and in smaller numbers to the east into Asia, there was a much larger second Indo-European expansion out of the corded ware culture, which centred around modern-day Germany and Poland. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows that after the initial Indo-European expansion into northern and central Europe in around 3000 BC, all subsequent Indo-European conquests outside of Europe occurred around the date 1500 BC. In 2000 BC, the Indo-Europeans conquered Britain. 85% of the population is replaced. In 2000 BC, the Indo-Europeans conquered Spain. The entire native male population is wiped out, and 40% of native DNA is replaced. In 1500 BC, Indo-Europeans conquered Greece and established Mycenaean civilization. In 1500 BC, Indo-Europeans conquered India and established Vedic civilization. In 1500 BC, Indo-Europeans conquered Iran and established early Iranian civilization. In 1500 BC, the powerful European Manetene kingdom in Syria is established. 1550 BC, ancient Babylonia in Iraq is conquered by Indo-Europeans. 1650 BC, ancient Egypt falls to the Hyksos, most likely led by Indo-Europeans. Now, by 1500 BC, the Indo-European Sassanid and Adrovo cultures had spread across Central Asia and had encroached into Mongolia and China. Who were these people? The visual appearance of these Indo-Europeans was starkly different to the native populations they came to conquer and replace. The head of Harvard's Ancient DNA Research Program, David Reich, describes these people as looking classically Northern European, with white skin, blue eyes and blonde hair. These people were genetically similar to Northern European populations living today. And this perhaps explains why many early civilizations described their gods and leaders as blonde, white-skinned or blue-eyed. This chart is from a 2015 ancient DNA study. As you can see, the corded ware group, 10th from the bottom, genetically most closely resembles modern-day Northern European populations. However, more recent research shows that Indo-Europeans of the corded ware culture were even more closely related to present-day Northern European populations. The Harvard March 2020 studies shows that the corded ware Indo-Europeans who reached Mongolia derived at least a third of their ancestry from European Neolithic farmers, which is significantly more than the proportion stated in the 2015 paper. The ancestral composition of these corded ware Indo-Europeans was nearly genetically identical to that of many Northern European populations living today. Ancient DNA studies show that 3,500 years ago, Indo-European populations made up the majority of inhabitants in Asian regions such as Kazakhstan, Western Mongolia and Western China. Most of the native hunter-gatherer groups who originally inhabited the Central Asian region before 1700 BC were largely displaced or wiped out by the invading Indo-Europeans. A large part of the various Oriental-type people that inhabit the Central Asian region today are largely descended from a much later movement of people descended from Han Chinese and Mongolian populations. These later East Asian conquests of Central Asia and the Indo-European speaking people living there were in part a result of a conflict that occurred between ancient Europeans and ancient East Asians at the edge of the Indo-European dominion in modern-day China and Mongolia, a conflict which ultimately the Indo-European populations lost. Using recent ancient DNA studies and other archaeological studies, this video will try to piece together what happened when the Indo-Europeans arrived on the heartlands of China and Mongolia, and why East Asian populations eventually managed to gain the upper hand and eventually conquer all the way into the heart of Europe. First, let's try to understand why the Indo-European expansion occurred in the first place. The recent ancient DNA studies that chart the Indo-European expansion tell a story of brutal conquest, mass-scale rape, enslavement, and genocide of various people around the world at the hands of Indo-Europeans. A level and scale of brutality almost unheard of in recorded history. It should be understood that this kind of conflict and competition between different groups could be considered as necessary for the evolution of man as much as individual level competition has been. When different human groups come into conflict or competition with one another, natural selection pressure begins to operate more strongly on the level of the group rather than the individual and his immediate kin. When war and competition between groups increases, individual reproductive success becomes increasingly determined by the actions and characteristics of the group as a whole, rather than the actions of the individual alone. Therefore, it stands to reason that if individuals possess genetic characteristics which benefit the group as a whole, then these genetic traits will be naturally selected for, even though they might benefit all group members equally. Group selection, by this definition, has therefore been an undeniable force in evolution. If we consider recent ancient DNA evidence which shows us how much groups conflict actually took place in our evolutionary past, then it seems rather clear that this selection pressure at a group level has played a significant role in the evolution of man. There are various definitions of group selection. Here I've written an explanation of how group selected traits might be selected for within a population group given strong group selection. Intense intergroup competition and selection would have also strongly affected how culture evolves. When groups come into conflict or competition with one another, the ideas, values, religion, etc. of that group are tested on the basis of how well those ideas allow them to compete with other groups. So when a conquest of a group occurs, both genes and cultural ideas are naturally selected. The effect of this group selection at both a cultural and genetic level is critically important for explaining the Indo-European expansion. The early Indo-Europeans were likely subjected to a level of group conflict and selection up to 10 times that of other people living on the planet at the same time. This is because the Indo-Europeans were the first people to domesticate the horse and invent the spoked wheel and warrior chariot. This essentially reduced the time difference between different groups. If people have horses to ride, chariots to carry things, and cattle as a mobile food source, then it becomes a lot easier and faster to traverse large distances, perhaps 10 times as easy, which means that more groups are going to come into conflict with one another, contact with one another, and more into conflict with one another. Horse domestication occurred amongst Indo-Europeans roughly 5,500 years ago. Large-scale cattle domestication occurred around the same time. The spoke wheel was invented by Indo-Europeans 4,000 years ago, but earlier forms of wheels and carts were used by Indo-Europeans previously. I would suggest that horse domestication brought about a period of intense intergroup competition amongst Indo-European tribes and their competitors, which led to genetic, cultural and technological changes that ultimately made the Indo-Europeans unbeatable. A possible trait that might have resulted from this period of intense intergroup competition is a higher level of intelligence or IQ. It is possible that within a particular group or culture, having a higher level of intelligence might not be beneficial for individual reproductive success. In fact, it might well be disadvantageous in certain social contexts. However, it seems obvious that higher IQ individuals would benefit the fitness of the group overall. For example, IQ is strongly linked with the ability to be good at completing complex tasks, such as making weapons, tools, organising and planning. Hence, high IQ group members would more than likely improve the fitness of the group overall. Is there any evidence that the Indo-Europeans had a higher level of intelligence than the people they came to conquer? paper published in 2012 by Michael Woodley of Manny shows that the spread of Indo European Y haploids correlates very strongly with the spread of genes for intelligence. There is a significant positive correlation between the frequency of Indo European haploids R1b and R1a1 and the average measured IQ. This would indicate that the emergence and spread of these Indo European haploids might have accompanied the spread of genes relevant to the development of higher intelligence. It has long been known that there were large European-type populations living in large agricultural communities in the Tarim Basin of Western China. Large numbers of mummified remains of European-type bodies have been found in the Tarim Basin, the earliest of which date back 3,800 years. The Tocharian language, which is an Indo-European language, was known to have been spoken in the Tarim Basin region until the medieval period, as numerous manuscripts written in the language have been found, dating from the 5th to 8th century AD. The earliest European mummies date back to 1800 BC, which is 300 years earlier than would be expected to find individuals from the second wave of corded ware Indo-Europeans in that region. These early European-type mummies are therefore associated with the first Indo-European expansion directly out of the steppes of Eastern Europe as part of the Yamnaya culture, and the group directly descended from the Yamnaya culture called the Adronovo culture. An ancient DNA paper called The Genomic Formation of Populations in East Asia was published in March 2020 by David Reich and his team at Harvard. The paper examines the genetic impact of incoming Indo-European populations on China and Mongolia. Let's look carefully at what the paper says. The paper shows that Indo-Europeans of the Yamnaya culture are first found in Mongolia in 3200 BC. The paper states that these Yamnaya populations of Mongolia later moved south and came to establish the agricultural communities in the Tarim Basin of Western China, from where the earliest European-type mummies are found. The paper states that there were unmixed Yamnaya populations living in Mongolia for roughly 2,000 years. The paper states that in around 1500 BC, the unmixed Yamnaya populations are nearly completely displaced when the corded ware Indo-Europeans arrived into Mongolia. The paper states that the Yamnaya population in the Tarim Basin genetically persisted until the Iron Age and were not wiped out by the corded ware populations. The paper states that genetic data infers that the Tocharian language was brought to Western China by the first wave of Indo-Europeans of the Yamnaya culture and not the later corded ware populations. So, the corded ware populations wiped out the Yamnaya populations of Mongolia, but not the Yamnaya communities of the Tarim Basin in Western China. What is the possible explanation for this? Both enslaved or taxed to work the land and provide food and resources for the conquering corded ware populations. Y haploid evidence from an early Bronze Age cemetery shows that corded ware Indo-Europeans arrived into the Tarim Basin of Western China in around 1500 BC. 7 males from the Zhihai cemetery in the Tarim Basin of Western China were analysed, and all 7 were found to have the Y haploid R1a1, which is the haploid associated with the corded ware expansion. None of the males had the R1b haploid associated with the first Yamnaya Indo-Europeans. Some of the females had East Asian haploids, but most of the females were European in origin and were more likely to have descended from the corded ware expansion, given the greater frequencies of their maternal haploids in Western rather than Eastern Europe. There's also clear archaeological evidence which shows the arrival of the corded ware populations into the Tarim Basin of Western China. So, we know that in around 1500 BC, the corded ware Indo-Europeans had arrived into Western China. We know that around the same time, they had wiped out the Yamnaya populations in Mongolia. We also know that in 1500 BC, they had conquered India and Iran. They had captured Babylonia in Iraq. They had established the Mitanni kingdom in Syria, and were most likely behind the Ecos invasion of Egypt. So, what do we see happening in northern and central China in around 1500 BC? Well, we see a dramatic change and improvement in metal and bronze production in the northern zone of China. Metal objects identical to the corded ware groups are found across northern China around 1500 BC. Here you can see the similarity between A, the knives associated with the corded ware derived Karakzuk culture in South Siberia, and B, knives found across northern China, including knives found in Anang, the capital of the Shang dynasty. Here you can see the similarities of spearheads. The Tarim Basin of western China might not have been suitable for cattle grazing, but the northern zone of China was. From 1500 BC, archaeologists have documented a major decline in agriculture and a dramatic shift towards pastoralism associated with Indo Europeans in northern China. Why did this happen? Using land to graze cattle or sheep would have produced roughly 500% less calories per acre than farming wheat or rice would have on the same land. So this dramatic shift towards pastoralism in 1500 BC would have effectively led to a fivefold decrease in the food available to populations living in northern China. So such an economic shift would not have been possible without a significant proportion of the populations being wiped out or displaced. In 1500 BC, we also see the establishment of China's first dynasty, the Shang dynasty, with its capital city Anang. The location of the Shang dynasty abuts what archaeologist Nicolas de Cosmo calls the Northern Zone, which experienced the rapid economic and cultural change around 1500 BC we've just discussed. In Angang area, we find achievements in metallurgy, wheel transport and horse breeding already in a developed form. The Yellow River area displays no preceding development. In other words, the technology came ready-made, was not developed in China, and was clearly derived from the corded ware populations. As its children's history book from the 1980s says, the establishment of the Shang dynasty and the sudden rise of highly developed and highly skilled metalworking industry has long remained a mystery to archaeologists, and it was apparently not influenced by any earlier civilization or northern. Christopher Beckwith, in his book Empire of the Silk Road, points out that the transmission of technology into northern China must have also involved the movement of Indo European people into northern China. Quoting, "Burials in the royal necropolis found in the ruins of Shang capital Anang include numerous chariots and horses, often along with chariot warriors and their weapons. They were also often found together with northern type knives typical of the steppe zone. It is now accepted that the chariot is an intrusive cultural artifact that entered Shang China from the north or northwest without any wheeled vehicle precursors. The practice of burying chariots along with the horses and young men with weapons, who seem to be their drivers or archers, is a distinctive mark of the central Eurasian cultural complex, which at the time was undoubtedly still exclusively Indo-European. Such burials are frequently found at Shang sites, usually in association with the burial of high-ranking noblemen. As noted, historical sources on Central Eurasia, from antiquity through the early Middle Ages, attest that the men who belonged to a lord's comitas were buried together with him and the horses, weapons and valuables. The introduction of the chariot and comitas burial in China can only be due to the appearance of Central Eurasian people there. The Harvard 2020 paper provides some genetic evidence which supports the argument that ancient Europeans established the Shang dynasty. The Harvard 2020 paper shows that present-day northern Chinese populations around the provinces of Gansu, Shaanxi and Shanxi surrounding the ancient Shang dynasty have approximately 2 to 3% European DNA, the ingress of which is estimated to date back to 3500 BC or earlier. Evidence of Indo-European involvement in early Chinese civilization can also be found in Chinese religion and mythology. The Yellow Emperor, also known by his Chinese name Hongdi, in Chinese religion is a legendary Chinese ruler portrayed as the originator of the centralized state, a cosmic ruler, and he is often regarded as the initiator of Chinese culture. He is referred to as the highest god of the Shang dynasty. Believed to have come from northern China, he is credited as inventing wheels, carts, the Chinese diadem, throne rooms, bow and arrow, early Chinese astronomy, the Chinese calendar, maths calculations, and the code of sound laws. Some scholars have suggested that the word yellow in Hongdi is more accurately rendered as blonde, referring to the colour of Hongdi's hair. The sinologist Tung Sung Tung Chang said that the epithet Hung Ti can etymologically be interpreted as blonde heavenly god. He suggests that Hung Di was related to Indo European migrations into China. The way in which the Indo Europeans came to establish the Shang dynasty could possibly be paralleled with the Indo European invasions of Iraq and Syria during the same time period. In around 1500 BC, recorded where Indo Europeans came to control the territories of Babylonia in Iraq and established the Mantinid Empire in Syria. In both separate cases, Indo Europeans acted as a military elite whilst co-opting different ethno-linguistic groups to fight for them. Hurrians in the case of Syria and Kassites in the case of Iraq. Since it happened twice before, it would seem plausible that Indo Europeans employed similar methods in China, plated the region, and harassed the Sung dynasties. In the 4th century AD, a confederation of various nomadic groups would come to conquer the Chinese dynasties to the south and unite the whole of China under the Northern Wei Empire. So let's try to work out what happened amongst the various nomadic groups and find out how Indo-European they were. From around 1000 BC, bronze inscriptions and oracle bones record events in which Shang and later Zhao dynasty troops fought frequent wars with neighbouring nomadic herdsmen, termed the Zirong, a term which translates roughly as Western barbarians or warlike tribes of the West. A Do Yul Bong's Ding vessel inscription unearthed tells that in 1816 BC, these Western barbarians attacked a Jin dynasty garrison in the lower Ordos region in northern China. It indicated that, like the Zhao, the Zirong fought on horse-drawn chariots. The description of these early nomadic herdsmen fighting with chariots and horses is the first chronicled in Chinese history. There were many other Chinese records mentioning the Zirong people who inhabited northern China. These Zirong clearly behaved like Indo-Europeans in terms of their economic and military ways. They are referred to as alien or non-Chinese by their southern neighbours. However, from 1500 BC to the 3rd century AD, there's very limited linguistic and genetic evidence, and it makes it very difficult to definitively state what their ethnic composition or their linguistic identity was. They certainly had some Mongol influence, and I don't know. But from the 4th century AD, numerous Chinese historical records describe the ethnic appearance of several of these northern Chinese groups. On Survive the Jive's YouTube channel about the Tarkarian mummies of Western China, he mentions a quote from the records of the Grand Historian, in which people seemingly described as European living in northern China are subject to genocide at the hands of the Zhao dynasty. Quoting, Min personally led the people of Zhao to butcher the barbarians without discrimination of social status, gender or age. The dead were more than 200,000 in number. At the time, more than half of the people with high noses and thick beards were massacred. Jinchu. Survive Jive states that this was referring to people living in the Tarim Basin of Western China, but the actual event was recorded as having taken place in northeastern China, at a settlement called Yi in the state of Wei, which is in the northeast of China, near modern-day Beijing, near to where the Shang and Zhao dynasties were established. The records of the Grand Historian referred to the people being slaughtered as being part of multiple groups who at the time were referred to as the five barbarians, or the Wu Hu. This was part of the Weiji War, which took place in around 350 AD. The war ended with a decisive victory for Ran Min and the Han Chinese, who then proceeded to issue the famous extermination order, which resulted in the extermination of virtually all of the Jai people and many other of the five barbarian groups. In regards to the ethnicity, the ethnic identity of the Jai and the other 5 barbarian groups, Charles Holcomb of the University of Michigan states the following, quoting, "Most of the references in contemporary Chinese sources to people with turbulent high noses, thick beards, or exotic green eyes and yellow hair, which presumably usually meant brownish, can probably be ascribed to the Jai, or to arrivals from western regions, or of the other 5 barbarian groups. The Zhang-Bi are rather interesting and are also described by many Chinese records as being ethnically European in appearance." The 5 barbarians was a term used to refer to all nomadic people residing in northern parts of China. During the period of the Weiji War, the 5 barbarians were said to consist of the following groups: the Xiongnu, the Ji, the Zhang-Bi, the Di, and the Quang. Several of these groups, including the Zhang-Bi, were themselves a confederation of many other distinct groups. After the Weiji War, the Jai were pretty much exterminated, whilst the Zhang-Bi came to dominate northern China, and the Chinese dynasties to the south. 50 years after the Weiji War, in 1386 AD, large parts of northern China came to be ruled by the Zhang-Bi, and by 500 AD they came to unify the whole of China, northern China, and rule over it. According to the sinologist Pingling Wang, in his 2018 paper, he states that some of the Zhang-Bi had Caucasianoid features, such as blue eyes, blonde hair, and white skin. The sinologist Edward H. Schaffer of Berkeley stated that many of the Zhang-Bi were blondes. The Book of Jin states that in the western state of Chao Wei, Zhang-Bi immigrants were known as the White Tribe. During the Tang Dynasty, the poet Zhang Jai described the Zhang-Bi entering Luoyang as yellow-headed. During the Song Dynasty, the poet and painter Su Shi was inspired by a painting of Zhang-Bi riding a horse and wrote a poem describing an elderly Zhang-Bi with reddish and blue eyes. It's Zhang-Bai, I think. The Emperor Ming of Jin was believed to have had Zhang-Bai ancestry. During a confrontation between the Emperor Ming and a rebel force in 324 AD, his enemies were confused by his appearance and thought he was a Zhang-Bai due to his yellow beard. It would be wrong to think that the people termed the Zhang-Bai were all European or Indo European in origin. But it does seem to be clear that there was a strong Indo European ethnic and cultural influence within this group. Although the exact details of the Indo European influence and where it came from is hard to judge. It's interesting to note, however, that it is thought that the ethnic label Han, designated to what we call ethnic Chinese, may have first begun to be actually applied by Chinese writers to ethnically Chinese people during the Northern Wei dynasty of the Zhang-Bai, as a way of distinguishing the ruling Zhang-Bi people from the conquered Han subjects. And it seems to be clear that a large proportion of the Zhang-Bai were considered ethnically distinct in appearance from the Han Chinese. The Northern Wei dynasty, established by the Zhang-Bai, was the most long-lived and most powerful of the northern dynasties prior to the reunification of China by the Song dynasty. Northern Wei art was heavily influenced by Indian and Central Asian traditions. The Wei rulers converted to Buddhism and became great patrons of Buddhist art. Many of the most important heritage sites of China, such as the Yunguan Grottos, the Longmen Caves and the Shaolin Monastery, the Shaolin Pagoda, were built during the Northern Wei period. Important books, such as the Qin Yao Shu and Commentary on the Water Classic, a monumental work on China's geography, was written during this era. During the latter stages of the Northern Wei dynasty, Emperor Zhao Weng implemented a drastic policy of centralization, intending to centralize the government and make the multi-ethnic state easier to govern. These policies included changing artistic styles to reflect Chinese preferences and forcing the population to speak the language and to wear Chinese clothes. He compelled his own Zhang-Bi people and others to adopt Chinese surnames and change his own family surname from Tubit to Yang. He also encouraged intermarriage between the Zhang-Bi and the Han. After various defeats and the fall of the Zhangbi Western dynasty of Tu Yuhun, the Zhang people underwent a massive dispolarization. During the Jin dynasty, it is noted that many Zhangbi women were sold off and given to many bureaucrats and aristocrats as servants and concubines. In the early Iron Age, the various nomadic groups outside of northern China and Mongolia that were outside of the control of established dynasties came to be controlled by the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were known to be an organised confederacy of many tribes, including many members of the other five barbarian groups. First established in 215 BC, they are widely thought to be the precursors to both the Huns and the Mongols. The Xiongnu established the biggest organised empire ever yet seen in the world at the time. It stretched across Mongolia, Siberia and China. The Xiongnu were long believed to have been strongly associated with Indo European populations of the steppe. Certainly they were in a technological and cultural sense. The Xiongnu were clearly a mixed populations of sorts, but what role might have Indo Europeans played? Did Indo Europeans establish this enterprise? Were Indo Europeans leaders of this group? In a 2020 study called A Dynamic 6,000 Genetic History of Eurasia, the Eurasian Eastern Steppe, it finds significant sex bias in favour of Indo-European males in the Eastern Steppe region, from the Bronze Age until the Mongol period in the 13th century. This is the period when the Xiongnu were at the height of their power. If the Xiongnu, a powerful conquering military force, were just made up of East Asians, why were Indo-European descended males getting a disproportionate number of women? The sex bias in favour of Indo-European descended males that persisted until the Mongol era is very interesting, but could perhaps be misleading, as it doesn't mean that the overall percentage of people with Indo-European ancestry was increasing during this period. A separate paper looking at Scythian populations of the steppes, published in 2019, shows that although there might have been a sex bias in favour of Indo-European descended males, the general population shift was in favour of East Asians. And very importantly, a significant transition was taking place, a switch from movements of European populations moving to the east to movements of East Asian populations to the west. This roughly started around the 5th century BC, 600 years before the Mongol era. This chart shows the ancestral proportions of Scythian and related Scythian groups, and groups pre- and post-dating the Scythian period of the 7th to the 3rd century BC. It covers a region ranging from Eastern Europe to Mongolia. The 6 bars on the bottom right show the ancestry of steppe populations prior to the Scythian period, starting in the 7th century BC, with the bars above showing steppe ancestry proportions around the 3rd century BC. The bottom 6 show coded word populations as a mix of Eastern hunter-gatherers and Nuthian. Don't be confused, this is the coded word genetic signature, as the paper states itself. The top 14 bars on the right show significant green proportions representing the ingress of East Asian DNA into Indo-European populations on the steppe. By the 3rd century BC, East Asian ancestry begins to come into Europe. The Crimeans are a particular outlier group showing significant East Asian ancestry from an earlier period. The bar 10th from the bottom shows Eastern Scythians found near the border region of Mongolia from the 5th to the 3rd century BC. Approximately 6% of their DNA is East Asian in origin by the early Iron Age. Bar 11 shows the ancestral composition of the Iron Age Saka. It's only around 40% East Asian. The Saka are not thought to be directly a part of the Scythian cultural complex. Rather, they are considered to be directly descended of the original coded word populations that moved into China. So there's this repeating trend from around the 5th century BC of expanding East Asian ancestry at the expense of Indo-European descended populations. Now, you might be thinking that this repeating trend can just be explained by the fact that the Indo-Europeans interbred with East Asian populations, passed on their technology and military culture, which was then turned upon other European populations. This would be a poor interpretation, as it doesn't really explain the repeating trend of East Asian populations expanding at the expense of Indo Europeans or European populations. It happened over too many separate occasions to be simply put down to chance. And if East Asians had some sort of cultural or organisational advantage over Europeans, what would have stopped Europeans from copying it and turning the tables? Even if the sex bias in the East remained in favour of Indo-European males, the increasing success of Eastern steppe populations over more Western populations might well have been due to the higher proportions of East Asian genes. The more East Asian ancestry a group had, the more of an advantage they held over other competing groups. Therefore, there would have been an inevitable expansion of East Asian genes. Now, you might be thinking this is just some wild theory, but if you bear with me to the end, you might be thinking it makes perfect sense. Let's summarise this East Asian expansion that occurred at the expense of European and Indo-European speaking populations. As we have discussed previously, it is likely that huge numbers of Indo-European populations in northern China were wiped out by the Han Chinese. In the 8th century, Turkic-speaking populations came to conquer Indo-European populations of the Tarim Basin. And we also see this repeating trend of expanding East Asian ancestry continues long into the medieval period. In the 4th century AD, we find Roman accounts of Huns breaking into Central Europe, driving the Germanic Goths into Roman territory, but possibly contributing to the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Huns were, at this time, had at least a third East Asian ancestry, and Y haploid data shows significant amounts of distinctly East Asian paternal haploids. Over the next 100 years after the Huns invade, we see successive waves of invaders into Europe from the east, with each successive wave having increased proportions of East Asian ancestry. Most notably the Turkic expansion during the Middle Ages, the Mongol invasions during the 12th century. By this point, the sex bias of the East Asian populations. When populations with equal technological abilities go to war, the outcome is for the most part determined by the numbers each side can bring to the battlefield. Had East Asian populations evolved a different psychology to Europeans? A psychology which made it easier for them to unite in large numbers under common leadership? A paper from 2010 provides some genetic evidence to suggest that East Asians are far more likely to conform their behaviour to the standards set by the group. The paper shows that present-day East Asian populations are more likely to feel more intense negative emotions when facing social rejection from the group, making them less individualistic by nature. That it can be easily theorised, therefore, that this genetic tendency towards conformity, or an extremely libertarian megastate in the case of North America. East Asian populations have evolved a psychology which made it easier for them to unite in large numbers, and therefore they had a genetic advantage over European populations during the period discussed. Does this explain the repeated trend of East Asian populations